Hello and welcome to the Irish History Show. My name is Cathal Brennan, and as always, I'm joined by my co-presenter John Dorney from the Irish Story website. If you'd like to listen to this or previous episodes of the show, you can go to our website, irishhistoryshow.ie, or follow us on Twitter at irishhistorypod, or go to our Facebook page, facebook.com/The Irish History Show. Now, we're very pleased once again to be joined by Barry Sheppard. Barry is the presenter of History Now on NVTV, and if you haven't seen them before, they're really, really excellent, and they're all up on Vimeo, and there's an awful lot of episodes there to go through, really good guests as well. And even myself and John were on it just over a year ago, so maybe that's the first one you should go for. As well, we should also say that Barry has been a guest before. There was an episode that we did about Winter na Tíre, so if you go onto our website, you can find that too. Today we were going to talk about the Irish press and their political cartoons and their cartoonist, Victor Brown. You're very welcome to the show, Barry.
Thanks very much, Cathal and John. Good to speak to someone who, other than my immediate family, we're all in this lockdown together.
Yeah,
Not that it's good to speak to a variety of voices.
Yeah, if the lockdown is good for one thing, it's for intensifying family bonds, Barry, isn't it?
The Irish press. People of a certain vintage of our age will remember the Irish press. But what was the Irish press?
Basically, the Irish press was a newspaper, daily newspaper that was established in the beginnings, really, by Eamon de Valera. So de Valera really saw the need for a national newspaper that put forward a Republican viewpoint. And he started to notice this about 1919, when he was on the tour of America, the very famous tour of America. And he noticed the favourable coverage he'd been getting in the United States, and it was compared to how Republicans were portrayed in the press in Ireland. And there wasn't any sort of, national newspaper that put forward their point of view. So this newspaper was established, came out in 1931. But if we go back, because it had a bit of a long gestation, and as I say, the idea started to come in 1919 of how a newspaper that was sympathetic to what would end up being anti-treaty Republicans, their viewpoint, and how this a national newspaper to accompany these viewpoints would be very beneficial. But if you go back even further than that, people have stated that the Irish press has basically evolved from what was a tradition of small and usually short-lived Republican journals. Like you hear about the Mosquito Press, things like Arthur Griffith's Scissors and Paste, things like that reported on sort of Republican ideals. The Irish press sort of evolved from that school of thought, and there was a newspaper, a weekly newspaper called The Nation, that Fianna Fáil had from their beginning. About March 1927, they had a weekly newspaper. Basically, it was a bit of a testing ground for what would eventually be the content of the Irish press. So very sort of Republican looking, very focused on native pastimes and things like that. When de Valera was on that very famous tour of the United States in 1919, 1920, he looked at how American newspapers reported on Irish Republicans and things like that. When you get to after the sort of Civil War era, when de Valera leaves Sinn Féin, I think it was Sean Lemass said that if Republicans didn't have a newspaper to back them up, they were almost like they're on a beaten to nowhere. So de Valera goes back to America in March of 1927 to raise funds for this new newspaper. But if you compare the reception he gets in 1927 to the really, really sort of euphoric reception that he gets in 1919, it's really chalk and cheese. There's hardly any people there. He's only had a handful of engagements, whereas before he was right throughout the United States. And crucially, very little was raised in terms of funds for the newspaper. Now, funding came from a variety of sources, and I'll talk about that in a second. He comes back to Ireland in February 1928, and then he sends out Frank Aiken and Ernie O'Malley to continue fundraising for the new paper. When O'Malley and Frank Aiken go out, their job is to gather Irish America and gather funds and whatnot. But Frank Aiken, in his speeches out in the Irish America, he's always highlighting, the relative success that Fianna Fáil had in the 1927 election. and really emphasising that if we had a national newspaper behind us at this time, that would really be, do our electoral chances more good. So they're out there in 1928 and trying to raise funds. Frank Aiken comes back. Ernie O'Malley stays out there, of course. And then in late 1929, De Valera goes out to finish the job of fundraising, and he gets some more money here and sets up a corporation for the Irish press in Delaware. Now, they do this because Delaware had fairly lax sort of economic laws, but basically they set up this company in Delaware where the Irish press, is based, where the money goes into. But basically, there were subscribers from Irish America, and this was worth 60,000 shares. These were non-voting shares. People who inputted in these didn't have a vote. There were 200 voting shares, which De Valera acquired for himself, ensuring control of the Irish press to De Valera and his family. But you also had, the 1919-20 Republican loan. People on behalf of De Valera wrote out to people who had subscribed to the Republican loan in 1919-1920 and asked them to reinvest their money in this planned newspaper. The people who invested in, the initial Republican loan in 1919-1920, I think about a third of those sought out a refund, while the rest either didn't want to get a refund or else actively wanted to transfer it over to De Valera to establish the Irish press. But a lot was made of the sort of political situation in Ireland where the pro-treaty people were in. The rhetoric from Frank Aiken and O'Malley when they were over there was that these people have betrayed the Republic. If we get a newspaper behind us, we'll be able to turn that over and eventually get the freedom that everybody wanted. In Ireland as well, they raised funds there, and basically this was a door-to-door, raising funds door-to-door, because naturally enough, existing newspapers wouldn't allow a potential rival to take out adverts in their newspapers. A really interesting thing when I was reading up on this, sort of found out that, William Martin Murphy, who owned the Irish Independent, he actually, had shares from the initial 1919-1920 bond drive, but of course he wasn't going to turn that over to allow De Valera to set up a rival newspaper. Pretty much the paper had a very long gestation from 1919, where these ideas started to come through, right to 1931. And September the 5th, 1931, the first edition of the Irish Press comes out.
Well, John, I might just turn to you there. The atmosphere for anti-treatyites going from the Civil War onwards, and you've really looked at an awful lot of the newspapers from that period and into the 1920s. How did mainstream national and regional newspapers treat the anti-treatyites and the anti-treatyite political movement after the end of the Civil War?
Well, I've looked at kind of the national newspapers more than the local ones. In the national sphere, you see the Irish Times is obviously a former unionist paper, recently converted from unionism, I suppose. The Irish Independent and the Freeman's Journal were both, as Barry kind of alluded to, owned by William Martin Murphy, and their line was pretty hostile to the anti-treatyites. One thing that surprised me actually was, of the two, the Freeman's Journal is much more vituperative, much more kind of abusive towards the anti-treatyites. Contrary really to Republican mythology, the Independent had a much more balanced line. Like the Independent was, for example, against the executions policy in the Civil War on the grounds that it was illegal and so on. In terms of regional press, like you see probably less uniformity than you might think. Like, for example, in the ones that I have looked at, for example, the Anglo-Celt, which is up in the Cavan Monaghan area, they're pro-treaty in a soft sense, as in they think they should accept the treaty and they're for peace, but they're kind of like, this is all a terrible shame and we wish everyone could get along. And they do report kind of without comment on anti-treatyites. So I think in the local press, you see a more kind of variegated picture, but certainly in terms of the national press, it's very much on the pro-treaty side, in some cases very harshly so.
And Barry, we get to a stage when Fianna Fáil is founded where Cumann na nGaedheal and Fianna Fáil are coming closer and closer in terms of the amount of seats that they have. And Fianna Fáil are actually getting closer towards power in the Free State. Yeah,
and that's highlighted, I suppose, after the 1927 election. And actually, you were talking about them on the John Jenks podcast, the last podcast, how they were almost neck and neck by 1927, and then of course you had that vote of no confidence. But when Aiken and Ernie O'Malley are in the United States, they highlight, how close things are and how many votes that Fianna Fáil got in the 1927 election. And I suppose a lot of people would have been very sort of taken with that and go, yeah, things might change. Then you had the establishment over there, like the Clan Gael people and stuff like that, who blamed De Valera for the Sinn Féin split. So they were very hostile to helping De Valera, and maybe they thought this was something of a vanity project. But the rise of Fianna Fáil is definitely highlighted as, if you give us money to establish this newspaper, this is going to continue on. And then when you actually do, the newspaper comes out, 1932 and 33, where they do win those elections, first with a minority government, and then the 1933, the Irish press was credited with helping them win those two elections.
Well, that's the thing. As I said, we're dealing with a period where there's no radio really. You really need to have a national newspaper supporting you to get your views across to the wider public.
Absolutely. And there's a really interesting sort of thing. And this Mark O'Brien covers this in his book on De Valera, Fianna Fáil and the Irish Press. That's the go-to book if you want to understand any of this sort of thing. But the way Ireland and on the island of Ireland, we had a very much more, much wider sort of rail network than we do now. Special trains that were carrying, like the Irish Independent, the other parts of Ireland, refused to take on the Irish press to bring them. So there was a battle around there to get this. So even people didn't want the Irish press, to get to these areas outside of Dublin. So there's a really interesting study around that. But yeah, it's hugely important to getting the message out there. When you see the likes of what came before, like the Nation newspaper, that was started by Sean T. O'Kelly, it came out weekly, and it wouldn't have had a big print run as what the Irish press did.
On that topic, so the national press or the press is a big deal at the time in terms of mass communication, and one of the aspects of it is the visual side, the cartoons. And on your Twitter account, Barry, you've been posting a lot of the cartoons from that era, and you can't help but be admiring of how kind of striking and clever they are.
Absolutely. And there's a book came out a number of years ago. Ciara Meehan was one of the editors of it, and she looks at the election posters from 1927 in it. And what she argues is that, of course, there was lots of high literacy levels in Ireland compared with a lot of other places, but society was becoming faster paced and it was becoming more visual. So Cumna Gael were basically the first political party to take this on, and get their election literature out there that featured a lot of visuals, a lot of graphics, things like that there. And this is reflected as well in the cartoons that you mentioned that I tweet out. I love them. I think they're so on point, and I think they have important messages for today, especially the last few years when you're hearing about trade disputes and things like that. There's a lot of things in there that you can pull out of those cartoons that apply to today.
Well, the Republicans were certainly no strangers to using political cartoons, not necessarily in newspapers, but on posters and magazines and stuff, even going back to 1960 and onwards. As you say, catching people's attention with visually is very important.
And I would argue that it goes back much further than that as well, because if you ever see some of the Land League posters, like the Land League were using multicoloured posters in 1881. And that's, like, if you see them today, they're very eye-catching. So what were they like in the likes of 1881? They must have been really, really eye-catching.
One of the things we should also say is that the Irish press was very innovative at the time for the type of stuff that they were doing, covering the GAA, the tabloid aspect of being a very popular paper. Can you talk about some of that?
Yeah, well, there's the likes of, Tim Pat Coogan, who actually was, editor of the Irish Press for a while. Other people as well have commented upon how De Valera's time in America really influenced how the Irish Press was packaged, basically, because you have the Irish Independent at the time, you have the Cork Irish Examiner. They would have carried adverts on the front page, whereas the Irish Press didn't do this. The Irish Press actually had photographs, it had cartoons. A lot of Victor Brown's cartoons appeared in the front page, but they also had, this on page 12, whatever. It was more engaging than, a bunch of really bland adverts that you had to sort of squint to look at because they were so small. the actual name for the Irish Press comes from an Irish-American newspaper of the same name. So America had a big influence in how the Irish Press was set up.
Barry, let's talk a little bit about the content of some of the cartoons before we move on to Victor Brown, who's your topic of research. And you know what? Can you talk about some of the really striking, for example, Coming to Nail election posters?
As I mentioned, Ciara Meehan has a really fantastic article in that edited collection that she does on, election posters in the 1927 election. So the Irish Press comes in September the 5th in 1931. So from that point onwards, they've got this platform and they're really on election footing. They're really pushing it and highlighting, not only in the cartoons, but of course in the newspaper itself, how Cumann na Gael, after a decade, have failed the Irish people. They've failed the national question. They're failing economically. And they're putting this to really good use. But what is really interesting is that these election posters from 1927, and I'll go through a couple of them now, the Irish Press are doing their version of this back on to Cumann na Gael, which I find really, really fascinating. So there's one particular one that, people have probably come across this one before. So there's De Valera as the shopkeeper, and it's called the non-cooperative store. And De Valera is standing out the front of the shop, and you've got the shop window, and you've got all these bargains in the shop, and the bargains are captions, no oaths taken, land annuities, you pay, we keep, high tariffs and all that. They're, like things that Fianna Fáil are known for and are the opposite of Cumann na Gael. And at the side, at the goods entrance, you've got a masked IRA figure with carrying bombs. And this is supposedly highlighting the links between Fianna Fáil and the IRA. And once it's really, well known that there's going to be an election soon in 1932, the Irish Press produce all these cartoons, and on the 2nd of January 1932, right at the beginning of the year, they do their version of that, and it is W.T. Cosgrave as the shop owner. So he's in the same position, he's in the shop window and he's fixing this mannequin. And the cartoon's called Dressing the Shop Window to Suit All Tastes. And whereas you had, land annuities, you pay, we keep, things like that, you had signs saying arms dumps conveniently found. And you have a list of bonuses that Free Staters got, and then ex-unionists, and it's like the proposed war monument that that they were going to have for them. You have all these, and it's really interesting. You see a tit for tat thing going on. There's another famous poster from the 1927 election, and it's "Don't prop up a rotten cause." And you've got De Valera in the crumbling house of Fianna Fáil, and you've got these, I don't know what they're called, they're rivets or something, that are holding things up. And written on each one of those, you've got, what have you got on it? You've got civil war, threat of war, and things like that on the De Valera one. They do their version of that, and it's someone called an ex-unionist and a Redmondite holding up the crumbling house of Cumann na Gael. And again, on these rivets, you've got messages which are about the war memorial and the threat of war or whatever. So there is a really good tit for tat thing going on. And then after the election is won, you have, in sometime in February of that year of 1932, the Irish Press cartoon, and it's a really like a told you so kind of mode, and it's portraying what they say is ex-unionists meeting to discuss what happened in the election, and all these ex-unionists are laughing, and behind them the posters, the Cumann na Gael posters from the previous election. The Shadow of the Gunman one, there's Master's Voice one, which are all about Fianna Fáil and the IRA. And one of the unionists is pointing at it and saying, well, we lost the election, but our money was well spent. And it went on this propaganda which defamed the natives better than we ever could. And that's really interesting that they talk about natives as if, unionists don't see themselves as natives, or Cumann na Gael aren't natives. So there's really, behind all this sort of the nice imagery, there's a really strong message of them and us behind it.
Yeah, that's it. Civil war politics. Yeah, it wasn't nice.
Yeah, and that really didn't stop with the 1932 election either. When the 1933 election comes up, it's a fantastic cartoon, and it's Cosgrave again. And interestingly, in all of these cartoons, Cosgrave is portrayed as a very small man. If you look back, a decade or more previously, you have Ernest Forbes, who was a cartoonist for the Freeman's Journal. He always portrayed David Lloyd George as a very small man. with a quiff in his hair, and that's the way W.T. Cosgrave is presented by Victor Brown in the Irish Press. Cosgrave is very small and he's standing beside John Bull and they're shaking hands with each other and they're both saying at the same time, I look to you to win this election for me. So they're portraying Cosgrave as a small man, but they're also portraying him as in the pocket of the British.
Well, I think one that springs to mind for me, and I'm not sure if it was the Irish Press that did it, that cartoon, Only Our William is in Step.
That's one of Victor Brown's as well. And there's a whole other thing about how ex-unionists or how unionists are portrayed in these cartoons, which is very interesting.
Yeah, I should say that for people who haven't seen it, it's like the two traditional ex-unionists in the top hats pointing at William Cosgrave marching off to vote for Cumann na nGaedheal, and he seems to be the only one, while droves of ordinary people are marching in another direction to vote for Fianna Fáil.
Yeah, that's it. Like, and it's absolutely them and us, you know.
I mean, that's the very negative side of Irish Press and Fianna Fáil kind of message. What about the more positive side? You know, the more positive kind of economic messages. Barry, you've written about their crusade against slum clearance in the Irish Press, for instance.
Yeah, there's a lot in the slum clearances. There's a cartoon that is in like about 2 weeks after the debut of the Irish Press. You have this cartoon of a family, a man, a woman, and a baby, and they're all in rags. They're very gaunt looking, and they're behind these bars. And the bars say on them the present financial system. But on the other side, you've got rays of sun coming in and the words in the distance saying plenty. So they are portraying this that they're going to change. They're going to change things. But there's something really interesting in that. And I don't want to lose people by delving too deeply into it. But that's something that I'm actually researching on at the minute, is some of the Irish Press cartoons like that. And of course, they're representing political change. But what they're also representing is Catholic social teaching around the family, which I find very interesting. There's a lot of sort of literature there on how Catholic social teaching was interpreted. And what I've done is take a selection of Irish Press cartoons and compare them with another journal of Catholic social teaching. And there's a lot of themes that come across there, especially around the family, around economic protectionism and things like that. The Irish Press, from the very beginning, the very first edition of it, talks about Catholic social teaching and what the encyclicals teach for, you know, the small landowner and what the encyclicals teach for the worker. And looking from the very first edition of the Irish Press right up to the end of that year, you get about 40 articles on Catholic social teaching. And that's, you know, reflective of where the Irish Press was in terms of its nationalism, in terms of its economic outlook, but in terms of its religious outlook as well, which I find very interesting. And the person behind that is no doubt Frank Gallagher, the first editor. Yeah, there's a lot of sort of things around Catholic social teaching where it talks about power imbalances and free trade and things like that. And I've been trying to tease out these themes in it. For example, there's an article, it comes in on the 8th of September 1931, and it talks about free competition and economic domination, about the evils of that. And that's straight out of the encyclical Quadragesimo Anno, which came out in 1931. And they're talking about trade protections and you know, and things like that, which, you know, Fianna Fáil are very famous for. But there's definitely some sort of Catholic social teaching element in that, and that's what I really trying to explore a bit more, you know.
And as you mentioned there, the Catholic social teaching, one of the other things might be interesting to talk about is the early radicalism of the Irish Press on economic issues and also on foreign policy issues unrelated to Ireland.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, there is, and I suppose there's been lots of people like exploring the connections between, say, Irish nationalism of that period and Indian nationalism, and the Irish Press are no different. There's a really interesting cartoon which talks about Indian self-government, and you have this Indian figure tied up to, you know, like a post that somebody would be corporal punishment where somebody had been whipped or something. So you have an Indian figure who's tied to that, and he's got his mouth bound over, and John Bull's, you know, in front of him, and it's all about, say that you want self-government if you want it. But of course, the figure can't say it. And John Bull saying, okay, I'll take that as no for an answer. They've definitely got their eyes on other countries. And that's really down to Frank Gallagher, I would argue. because if you look at what Frank Gallagher, he was the first editor from September 1931 to 1935. But as the Irish Press is being set up, the news distributor, British United Press, so Gallagher contacts him and, outlining the type of stories that the Irish Press would be interested in. Gallagher's interest that he wants in that are events in Catholic nations, Catholic events, the actions of Catholic parties in other countries. But there's also reference to, international matters, but also protection and tariffs, industrial and agricultural tariffs. But this international element is definitely part of it, and that's reflected in many of the cartoons that you see.
And also another issue might be the League of Nations. And this is something that's very close to De Valera and Fianna Fáil, and something that has a positive representation of Ireland abroad, Ireland's role within the League of Nations. Was that something that was covered much?
Well, do you know what? To be honest with you, I don't see much about the League of Nations in it, but in terms of how Ireland saw themselves, or how, more specifically, how De Valera, the Irish Press and Fianna Fáil saw Ireland in terms of the world. They saw Ireland as this sort of bastion of peace and tranquility, promoting this peace and tranquility, because it's a really interesting cartoon that shows the whole island of Ireland. Of course, that's a very loaded sort of question on partition, but you've got a man within Ireland, you've got a figure of a plough, somebody ploughing the fields, which really representative of Fianna Fáil's view on small farmers and tillage. Outside of Ireland, you've got you've got Japan-China war, you've got stuff going on in America, Mexico, things like that. So it's showing a chaotic world outside of Ireland, and Ireland's this, tranquil, rural, idyllic nation, which, as we all know, didn't reflect the reality of early 1930s Ireland. But yeah, in terms of internationalism, they really wanted to promote this idea of settled nation.
Barry, if we can move the conversation on a little bit, one of the amazing things is many of these cartoons, the visual aspect of the Irish Press came from a man called Victor Brown, who was not Irish at all, in fact.
He's a very interesting character, but there's not really an awful lot written about him, and that's what I'm hoping to change with all of this. In terms of who he was English born. He was born in Nuneaton in Warwickshire in 1900. He did have connections to Ireland. His father was in the British Army, stationed in Ireland, and Brown spent some of his childhood in Ireland when his father was stationed here. He returned around the age of 20 to study art in Ireland, and became friends with Jack B. Yeats and William Butler Yeats and other people like that, who were mainstays of the Irish sort of cultural revival. He was very interested in what would probably be termed Celtic art. But he had a lot of things that were going on outside of that. As I say, he was English, and I think he treated this, just as a job, because other things that he did around this period, in like 1934, he designed the wedding cake for the Duke of Kent. Far from being a staunch nationalist, he was an artist for hire, really. And he does have sort of similarities in that respect with Ernest Forbes, who produced some really, really fantastic editorial cartoons during the War of Independence, which were very nationalistic. But Forbes as well was an Englishman, and Felix Larkin has done a lot of work on Ernest Forbes.
If it was just an artist for hire, like a paintbrush for hire, we could say, and he wasn't doing it out of conviction. He was very clued in, though. I mean, the messaging is very spot on in the cartoons.
Oh, absolutely. And there's another thing that would sort of indicate that he might have had, not sympathies, but a deep knowledge of it. He designed the 25th anniversary commemorative stamp for the Easter Rising. And it's actually recreated in a mural in Beachmount Avenue, just off the Falls Road in Belfast. It's the volunteer in front of the Burning GPO. So he did do things like that. But other things that he did was he was commissioned to do a portrait of Guillermo Brown, Admiral William Brown, who was the father of the Argentine Navy, and he designed the sets for the Irish Hospital sweepstakes, and he also did adverts for those as well. So he had a very varied career, that took him away from nationalist projects.
Yeah, I mean, in fairness, he wouldn't be the only Englishman who had a deep connection with Irish republicanism. I'm thinking of people like Erskine Childers and so on.
Of course, Erskine Childers had a very productive, and I don't know if deep's the word, but, they're very good working relationship with Frank Gallagher before he came on and became the first editor of the Irish Press. Gallagher was aware of these people as well, you know.
It might be a good time now to actually tell people who Frank Gallagher was.
Yeah, so Frank Gallagher, as I say, is the first editor of the Irish Press. He was born in 1893 in Cork, I think, as far as I'm aware. And he was a trained journalist by the time he joined the Volunteers in September, October time of 1917. And he had worked for the Cork Free Press. But he was, this made me smile, he was their Westminster correspondent. Then he worked for, you know, other journals and things like that, like PJ Little's New Ireland newspaper, and probably where he earned his stripes really was the Irish Bulletin. And I think that's where he worked with Erskine Childers during the War of Independence. But besides his revolutionary credentials, he was a very, very pious Catholic. And I think that's reflected in his communications with the British United Press, that he was looking at events in Catholic nations. Of course, that was going to appeal to the public who were going to be reading the Irish Press. But I think that you can find a lot of his own personal interests in there as well. Yeah, he also wrote that really sort of famous and celebrated account of the revolutionary period, 4 Glorious Years. But he also, interestingly, wrote a really good pamphlet on the need for a national newspaper in Ireland, which reflected, you know, Republican viewpoints.
As we get towards the end, Barry, is there a sense that, like, the Irish press, like Fianna Fáil a little bit, is quite radical on various issues, including, you know, social and economic issues before Fianna Fáil comes to power, and then it becomes a bit more conservative? Do you see that?
I think it has to be said, first of all, that in relation to the first few years of the Irish press seemed really, really chaotic outside of, you know, Frank Gallagher's sort of control. Gallagher was there from September 1931 to 35, and the position between paper and party were really, really close. It's only when John Sweetman, you know, John Sweetman was one of the founder members of Sinn Féin, so William Sweetman is his son. He comes in 1935, and under his editorship, there's a bit more distance put between paper and party. So in those early years where Victor Brown's cartoons are featured, it's a very close relationship, and I think what's reflected in the paper is reflective of Fianna Fáil's policies and views.
Mm-hmm. And like, you know, we spoke a little bit about the slum clearance and so on, and the early Fianna Fáil is quite statist, and they do try to build social housing and develop Irish industry. And you know, the perception is that kind of fades as the late 30s comes around, and they become more of a conservative party, really.
Yeah, and there's just one popped into my head. It isn't the sort of standard editorial cartoon, but it's more like an advert for native industries about turf and things like that. And Victor Brown actually draws that as well.
I'd be interested as well to look at how the Irish press and its cartoons viewed things like the Irish language too and Irish culture.
Well, I know the Irish press did have, you know, Irish language, not so much a page, but section in the newspaper. There's nothing really that comes through in the cartoons of Victor Brown that would reflect a love of the Irish language. The only thing that really comes close is when, and I think this is very, very important, and it's very important for how Fianna Fáil viewed themselves, is inheritors of a long Republican past, and they claim ownership of the past very, very well through the cartoons. And I'll give you an example of this. Is the day before, and I think it's 1933. Yeah, 1933. So the day before the annual Bodenstown commemoration of Wolfe Tone, the Irish press publishes this cartoon of Tone, of his grave, and the sun's rays coming out, you know, and it's very romantic and saying, you know, the life-giving rays. So, like, you know, they're trying to claim ownership of Wolfe Tone. But more interestingly, there's another one which is called the Eternal Flame. Basically, that is Lady Liberty leaning over a small fire. And as I say, the cartoon's called the Perpetual Flame. And in each of the flames in the fire, there's a date of a rebellion in Ireland on it. So you have 1641, you have 1798, you have 1803, 1848, 1867, 1916, of course, and then 1922. This is, you know, reflective of how Fianna Fáil see themselves as the inheritors of all these different parts of republicanism. I was reading Graham Walker's article on Frank Gallagher, and in that he shows that Gallagher and Erskine Childers, in the bulletin that they worked together on, in July 1921, just after the truce, Gallagher writes this piece in it, and there's a quote from it and says that the piece that he's written, he says, "This brief review shows the sober, uninterrupted progress in recent years of a movement having its roots deep in the past and representing the permanent tradition of the Irish race." And that's really reflected in that cartoon. And they see no difference between, Wolfe Tone and then, the Fenian uprisings of the mid-19th century, and then, of course, their own. But interestingly, when you go back as far as 1641, it's a very simplistic view of, a couple of hundred years of Irish history, but it's all leading to the Irish press and what they're doing. You mentioned the Irish language there. On the first anniversary of the Irish press, so the 5th of September 1932, you have the Irish press represented as an Clive Solace, the Sword of Light. And it's basically a hand holding this Sword of Light, and on the blade it says the Irish press. So they're reclaiming, Padraig Pearse's and Clive Solace there. So they're tapping into the cultural revival as well. So they're basically, through 100 years, they're hijacking and making all these different elements of Irish history their own.
Yeah, but that is the essence of, the kind of nationalist Fianna Fáil message, though, isn't it? That history is one story of one family, like one nation, moving towards history to a goal. I mean, it's the message distilled, isn't it?
Absolutely, and it's they're really seeing. You see, like what it said there when Frank Aiken was in America trying to raise funds for it. It's almost about this is coming to the apex of history. We're so close, and the Irish press is the vehicle that's going to, deliver us to the promised land.
It was funny. I was just reading a thing there during the week. There was an anecdote about a couple of men down the country, and they're saying, "When did your family join Fianna Fáil?" It's like, "Our family have been Fianna Fáil since 1916." And the other fella says, "Our family have been Fianna Fáil since 1798. This concept of this Fianna Fáil is just a movement that has been going on for generations, back to centuries.
Yeah, it is related to that. The issue of partition and the rest of the nation coming in, that's not really addressed too much in the press. And I suppose that's reflective of, the tokenistic way that people in Fianna Fáil viewed the 6-county state.
Yeah, I was just going to ask that very question, Barry. I mean, does the Irish press get sold? Does it get read much in the north?
Well, in the beginning, I don't know how long this lasts for, but they did have a correspondent in Belfast. And I think from memory, he was probably based in the same sort of offices that the Irish News were based in. I can't remember who it was, but I know it was read in parts of Belfast, and you probably know which parts of Belfast it was read in, But there's a really interesting cartoon, and I have to get that, talk about this before I forget. And it's in relation to the press in the north. I think it's about maybe about November of the first year. So Victor Brown, it has to be said, Victor Brown was only the cartoonist of the Irish press for 2 years. This last one that I found, last cartoon, comes on the 2nd anniversary of the foundation of the Irish press. So September 1933, really. We talked there about how ex-unionists are portrayed with the monocles and the top hats and things like that. The November 1931, I can't remember the exact date, shows you a line of reporters from major Irish newspapers. They're in line to get a story from Ernest Blythe. So the reporters are very cliched looking, wearing the trilby hats that have the press ticket in the ribbon. And they're all around waiting on the scoop. And they're saying, well, the Irish press have already got this scoop. But if you look along the line, so you've got, the Cork Examiner, the Independent, people like that represented, they're written on the actual figures who are the journalists. But at the very back, you have a journalist with an orange man's bowler hat, and he's a representative of the newsletter. But he's also, if you look down, he's given a Masonic hand signal, which is, it's a really stark insight into how, people in the Irish press viewed people from the newsletter and Northern Protestants more generally.
Yeah, and just on the partition thing, I mean, Fianna Fáil has kind of a really odd attitude towards it, because before they come into the Dáil and before they come into government especially, they're always banging on about partition. And De Valera is even briefly elected as an MP in absentia in the north. But like, once they get into power, little or nothing. And De Valera always refuses to organise Fianna Fáil in the north, despite the fact his supporters there wanted him to. It's a bit odd.
Dermot Farder's recent book on the border and partition, he's very scathing of the likes of De Valera and even Frank Aiken, who was from a border region in the north, and how they viewed the north in sort of almost, of course, romantic terms, but not in any sort of, they didn't really engage with it in any meaningful way. But there is one of De Valera's historical heroes, Abraham Lincoln, features bizarrely in a cartoon about partition. You've got the island of Ireland drawn there with a very crude, almost like the outside of a jail, barbed wire and stuff. It's very crudely drawn in a square, cuts out most of Fermanagh and Derry. But you've got people on one side of it and people on the other, and the ghost of Abraham Lincoln standing over and saying, get rid of this barrier or it'll tear you both apart. Now, that's where partition's mentioned, but there's also one that's mentioned very early in 1932, and it's entitled Where Milestones Are Tombstones. And it's a direct response to a Cumann na Gael election slogan, which is keep marching on. And that, as I was reading about that, struck me, it's very reminiscent of the recent Fine Gael slogan of let's keep the recovery going. So the Irish press lay out of things, that, what progress, keep marching on. Well, this is the progress that you've had. So it features a load of tombstones coming down into this bog, and this bog's called the Bog of Bankruptcy. So on it, you have, on the individual headstones, you have the treaty, partition, the oath, and then boundary betrayal. And I know you covered the Boundary Commission and how that perhaps damaged Cumann na Gael. You covered that in the last podcast. But you've got all these things, that are basically about partition, and they're the only two real ones that address partition.
Well, Barry, I was just curious, how did the Irish press deal with non-Fianna Fáil Republicans as Fianna Fáil conciliated their power in the 30s and the 40s, and particularly with the arrival of new parties like Clan na Póblachta?
It's a very interesting question, and to be honest with you, it's something that I don't know, because what I focused on, it really is this period that Victor Brown's in the Irish press, and that's only a couple of years, really.
But how about like the sorry, Barry? How about the Fianna Fáil attitude towards the IRA? Do they get covered by Victor Brown or not?
Interestingly, they do, and in January 1932, just before Fianna Fáil come to power, they have a really interesting cartoon that shows you IRA prisoners in the prison yard walking around and round. And on the wall, outside the wall on one side, you have unionists. They're not even ex-unionists, they say unionists, and they're wearing the top hats and the manacles, and they have this big sign saying they should be shot. But on the other side, you have what is the people. It says the people. So it's the Irish people, actually, sorry, it says. So you've got that differentiation there, and they're holding up a sign saying, release the prisoners. But the headline of this cartoon is the freedom to achieve freedom. So, it's taken that very famous Michael Collins quote about selling the treaty and showing that there's still IRA prisoners in jail in 1932. And this would have been very personal to Frank Gallagher as well, because he was interred by the Free State, the pro-treaty side, from 1922 to 1924. So obviously he would have had that experience there, but he also would have known many of the people who were in there. But yeah, that's one of the only ones at the show where there is support for the IRA, but that's 1932, before Fianna Fáil come in, and then it all changes. Then after that, their focus, the vast majority of the focus of the cartoons, is on the economic war and ridiculing W.T. Cosgrave, but also ridiculing J.H. Thomas, the Minister for Dominions. So they're the two feature people. Ramsay MacDonald also gets ridiculed as well, but they're not so much focusing on any particular group, more the trade dispute that's kicking off. And I would really love if Victor Brown had continued on there. You would have got more and more stuff about the economic war as that developed. But also there's a real, sort of, I don't know if it's a regret, if it's my personal regret, it probably wasn't one of his, that he doesn't feature the blue shirts or anything like that. I think he sort of finishes there just as they're, on the ascendancy. So it would have been very interesting to see how the Irish press would have covered the blue shirts in cartoon form.
Yeah, and just to kind of bring it up to date, Barry. I mean, today, like political parties generally don't use cartoons or illustrations so much, but like the meme on the internet, which is essentially visually the same thing, is very much alive and well. Do you see that as kind of a continuation of what people like Victor Brown were doing back in those days?
Absolutely, but there's less originality. People are just using the same memes but changing the text. It is basically the same thing, because there are people who are scholars of the history of political and editorial cartoons, and who argue that it carries with it much more emotive weight than, say, a paragraph or two of text. These visual images do get a message across, and it's the same with memes. But there are some memes that you can't help but laugh at, but then you see the same one again and again and again, and that wasn't the case really with this type of art form.
Yeah, I mean, with internet arguments, which you should never have, by the way, political arguments on the internet. But I do find people responding to an argument with a cartoon or a meme, and I do want to come back sometimes and say, sorry, that's not an argument,
Yeah. Oh yeah, and the internet has really killed off intellectual discussion. So you can't be surprised by how people will just post something like that, and it'll kill off not only the argument but any sort of regard you have for them.
Indeed. Carl, do you want to get in there to finish?
Yeah, no, I think we've covered it. Is there anything left that you'd like to cover, Barry? Anything that we missed?
No, like I say, he was only there for 2 years. He died in 1953 in Dunleary. During his time there, as I say, the cover, the claiming of the Republican past, the ridicule, come to Gale. But there's also a really interesting one there, and I suppose it reflects upon a political debate that was happening just before this coronavirus came in, and that was on the RIC. So that's the only thing that I can think of at the minute that they didn't cover. It's about RIC pensions, and it's a very interesting one with John Bull sitting eating, and Ireland, the waiter is Ireland, coming along with the bill. And John Bull saying, "Oh, so you want me to pay for something after I've eaten? How ridiculous." And there's a lap dog sitting beside him, which is coming to Gale, and the dog saying, "Yes, fancy." But that's to do with RIC, the paying of RIC pensions. That's probably the only one I can think of now. But as I say, 2 years basically from end to end that he was there covers an awful lot of cartoons, and I'm hoping to, eventually publish something on it.
Okay, we look forward to hear more on that. Thanks, Barry.
No worries. Thanks very much, Cal and John. Good to speak to you again.
And if anyone would like to listen to this or previous episodes of the show, you can go to our website, irishhistoryshow.ie, or follow us on Twitter at Irish History Pod. It's probably the best way to contact us as well if you want. And you can follow us on Facebook, facebook.com/The Irish History Show. Okay, I hope everyone is keeping well at home and we get through this lockdown pretty quick. Once again, thank you very much to Barry Sheppard, and check out his show, History Now, on NVTV. They're all up on Vimeo. And thanks to John Dorney too. Okay, see you. Thank you.